Welcome into Locked On Horned Frogs. A committee does not like the TCU football team. This probably doesn't surprise you. We'll talk about it next.
You are Locked On Horned Frogs, your daily podcast on the TCU Horned Frogs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
It is Locked On Horned Frogs. I'm Steven Simcox. So TCU comes in at number 7 in the first college football playoff rankings. This is the first set of rankings. It's fluid. They'll do this week to week. This goes on through the conference title game, as I'm sure many of you know. But they're sitting there at 7. They're right behind Alabama at 6. Here is your rankings. Tennessee at 1, Ohio State at 2, Georgia at 3, Clemson at 4, Michigan 5, Alabama 6, TCU at 7. The only two other Big 12 teams ranked at the moment, Kansas State at 13, and then Texas at 24. Frogs already played K-State and won that game at home a few weeks ago. Have not played Texas yet. We'll play them in Austin, not this Saturday, but next Saturday after that Texas Tech game. So I don't want to get super worked up about these rankings yet. Now I might fail tonight. Like I might, as I'm talking about it, I might get worked up. And the reason I don't want to overreact too much yet is because this is the first one. But I already have a beef with the committee. I think TCU fans in general are probably sensitive to where the committee ranks them. Ultimately, I believe that TCU, if they handle their business and keep winning games, a lot of this will take care of itself because Tennessee and Georgia, well, they're going to play each other. Michigan and Ohio State, they're going to play each other. Alabama potentially will play Tennessee or Georgia in the SEC title game if they win their next few games, which they're playing LSU, they're playing Ole Miss. And again, there seems to be a heavy SEC bias by the committee. They really like these SEC football teams. LSU sitting at number 10. And man, like LSU under Brian Kelly, they've had a nice turnaround. But that's the same team that lost their season opener to Florida State. They've looked really bad at times, but they're sitting there at number 10 with 2 losses. Alabama lost to Tennessee on the road. Great football game. Lost to the number 1 team in the country. So I understand not dropping them out of the top 10, keeping them up there high. But TCU is undefeated. And the resume should mean something. My issue is, I feel like the committee is already setting up a scenario where a one-loss TCU team, even a one-loss TCU team that wins the Big 12 title, could be left out in favor of an Alabama, a one-loss Tennessee that doesn't make the conference title game because they lost to Georgia, potentially Clemson, and Clemson's undefeated at the moment as well. And so I'm not going to make a huge deal about them being at number 4, but they are at number 4. And I saw this from Sam Kahn, who writes for The Athletic. He covers the Texas schools in college football. Because in the first CFP rankings, TCU is number 7, Clemson's number 4. Both have a resume that's pretty similar. Clemson's FBS opponents, 30-26. TCU's FBS opponents, 30-26. Clemson has beaten 4 FBS teams that are over 500. TCU has also beaten 4 FBS teams that are over 500. Those resumes sound really similar. So what's the difference? Well, I mean, Clemson has some more pedigree, right? Like Dabo Swinney. He's done a really good job there. They've won a couple national titles. They're frequently in the college football playoff mix. So they just get the benefit of the doubt. Alabama drops a game to Tennessee. They get the benefit of the doubt. And so each week, the playoff committee trots out their chairman who gives reasons for these rankings. They ask him questions. There's a back and forth. He gives reasons for these rankings. And this year, it's Boo Kerrigan. Here's the man right here. He is the athletic director at NC State. Now, let me tell you something. I wouldn't want this job. I think this is a pretty thankless job. I'm not a huge fan of the committee. And this is the guy that has to go out there and basically say, hey, this is why we ranked this team here and this team there. And inevitably, there's a lot of contradictions that come with that because there's so many different teams and they're not playing each other in a lot of instances. And so people just pick apart and kind of throw tomatoes at him. And so that's this guy this year. There's Boo Kerrigan for you. And he said, amongst other things, but this is what stood out to me. This is from Heather Dinich quoting him, and Heather Dinich covers the CFP for ESPN. She says TCU having to come from behind was an issue in the room. Okay, so yeah, TCU having to come from behind, right? Didn't always control the football game. Had a big deficit against Oklahoma State, came back and won. Big deficit against Kansas State, came back and won. Makes sense. Except, does Alabama not get dinged for having to come back and win a game against Texas early in the season against a backup quarterback in Hudson Card? And I know TCU's faced their share of backup QBs. Does Clemson not get dinged for having to come back and win against Syracuse a few weeks ago after benching their starting quarterback? Does Clemson not get dinged for not fully controlling the game against Wake Forest and winning in overtime? Does Alabama lose any points for getting taken to the wire by Texas A&M at home? Or is it just TCU? Because it feels like it's just TCU. I've talked about this team all year. I realize they have some flaws. Defense can be leaky at times. They're in year one of a new regime. The offense isn't always super efficient, but they score a lot of points. They played complimentary football for a lot of the year. And you know what? At the end of it, a lot of these games they've won. Like, at the end of the day, they beat West Virginia by 10 points. They beat Kansas State by 10 points. They came back and beat Oklahoma State. Winning the games should mean something. And it just feels like everybody else, all these brand names, end up getting a second chance. They get a mulligan. And there's this pressure on TCU to win out. And you know what? And I'm not saying these things are going to happen. But if TCU trips up at home against Texas Tech on Saturday, if TCU goes to Austin and loses to a talented Texas team, or loses to a Baylor team that seems like they might be catching their stride, if they drop a game, and they got kind of a tough 3-game stretch here, Big 12, you got to play everybody. It's a hard league to go undefeated in. Going undefeated is difficult. It's like the committee is acknowledging that, and I can appreciate that. They're saying it's hard to run the table. Even if you're Clemson, even if you're Alabama, even if you're Georgia or Tennessee, it's hard to run the table. But if you're TCU, you have to do it. It doesn't make sense. I fear that the Frogs will almost be automatically kicked out of the mix if they lose a game. And that logic doesn't seem to apply to a lot of other teams in college football. I don't get it. It's just like, oh, they lost. Well, they're fraudulent. No, maybe they just had a bad week. And they haven't lost a game yet. That's the other thing. They haven't lost. They're 8-0. They've won. They've continued to win. And they're going to have to continue to win and hope that that's enough. But you know what? I just have this sneaking suspicion that if you threw an OU logo on that helmet, or if you threw a Texas logo on that helmet, and they were sitting at 8-0, and they had wins at home against Oklahoma State and Kansas State, they had a blowout win at home against Oklahoma. They went on the road to West Virginia and got a dub. I feel like those teams will be in the top 5, maybe even the top 4. And that's why it's frustrating to me. It's like, if we're just going to use the eye test, why play the games? And the argument that all these other schools are going to have, they'll say this. They'll just say, oh, well, if TCU played Alabama this Saturday on a neutral field, come on, what would the line be? And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it might be Alabama getting 10 points. They might be 10-point favorites. Maybe Vegas has a little more respect for the Frogs, where the money comes in on TCU and it creeps down to like 7.5. But yeah, they'd probably be underdogs if they played Alabama today. I bet they'd be underdogs if they played Clemson. But Like they haven't. They played the teams they played. They've won the games. And their resume is strikingly similar to these other teams. And it just feels like they're not getting the respect that everyone else gets. Sam Khan also said, for comparison's sake, number 6 Alabama 7-1. Their FBS opponents this year are 34-30. They're 3-1 against FBS teams over 500. TCU 8-0. FBS opponents are 30-26. So also 4 games over 500. 4-0 against FBS teams over 500. Yeah, TCU has some top 25 wins against Oklahoma and Kansas that don't look as good as they did at the time. But they won those games. They went on to win games against teams like K-State looks pretty good right now. Not sure what's going to happen with Oklahoma State. Obviously, the Spencer Sanders injury is a huge factor in that. But they've beaten the teams in front of them. Why not let them play themselves out of the mix instead of forcing them to try to constantly prove themselves? I just don't get it. I feel like I got a little more worked up than I should have about this. I want to know your thoughts, so comment on YouTube. Some of you respond to me on Twitter. I'm at SimcockSteven on Twitter. There it is. There's a handle at SimcockSteven on Twitter. The show is at Locked On TCU. I have a couple tweets up about the rankings on Tuesday night. If you want to interact with them that way, that's fun, or that's fine. I'll try to reply to you. And subscribe to the show on YouTube. Locked On Horned Frogs. You can subscribe on YouTube. You can listen on your favorite podcast app. I want to talk Texas Tech for a minute here in segment 2. Before we do that, though, I do want to tell you about LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs. You know LinkedIn. You know that name. And that's one of the big advantages to using LinkedIn when it comes to hiring, because they are the standard when it comes to finding jobs. They're what people use. It's really easy to create a free job post on LinkedIn Jobs. You can add your job to the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. They have simple tools like screening questions, and it makes it easier to focus on the candidates that you need to find for your small business. If you need to hire somebody, use LinkedIn. Talent acquisition, it's like recruiting. It's the biggest part of owning a business, finding people that you can trust, that can do the job well. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs number 1 in delivering quality hires versus their leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to, and they do it faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Again, that's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. As always, terms and conditions do apply. All right, so Texas Tech, right? So let's get off the college football playoff train for a minute, even though I'm sure we'll revisit that the rest of this week and in the weeks to come. TCU plays Texas Tech this week, and speaking of taking care of business on the field, they'll have to do that again. To get to 9-0, they have to beat the Red Raiders. Year 1 under head coach Joey McGuire, who came over from Baylor. They're 4-4. They're coming off a pretty rough loss to Baylor. I was shocked by what happened against BU, because Tech's tough to play in Lubbock. It was a night game, Halloween weekend, Patrick Mahomes' retirement ceremony at halftime. I just thought they'd be riled up, the players would be ready to go, and it didn't happen that way. They got blown out by Baylor. Hung with them for the first half. As that game went on, the Bears separated. Week before that, they blew out West Virginia. So they've been kind of up and down this year. Beat Texas earlier this year. Lost a close game to NC State. They've hung with some good teams. Now, one interesting thing to me about Texas Tech is this QB shuffle they got going on. So to start the year, Tyler Shook actually won this job. And if you remember that name, and if you're like, man, I feel like I've heard that name forever. Well, he transferred in a few years ago from Oregon. And there was a time when Tyler Shook was like rumored to potentially be a future first-round draft pick in the NFL. It's never really worked for him, and mainly that's been because of the injury bug. He just hasn't been on the field. And so Shook went down early in the season, and Donovan Smith came in. And it seemed, I don't really know. I'm going to talk with Chris Level later this week, who does Locked On Texas Tech and also works for the Red Raider Sports Radio Network. I haven't watched every Tech game, but I felt like when I watched the team, Donovan Smith was really electric. He was had a 66% completion percentage, 1,500 yards passing, 12 touchdowns, 8 picks, so struggled to take care of the football. And he was also a threat running the football, only 96 yards on 68 carries, but he can get out of the pocket and make plays. But they turned it over to Baron Morton, true freshman QB. He's out of Eastland. He was a highly rated kid coming out of high school. And, I mean, he's been effective. Like, he's completing 56% of his passes, 6 touchdowns, 6 picks. He struggled against Baylor, but he's had some good games this year too. And it seems like he's going to be the starter. But in that Baylor game, they had Morton out there. He wasn't having his best night. They put Donovan Smith out there. At one point, they threw Tyler Shuck out there for a drive. All three of them turned the ball over. They were throwing picks and giving Baylor chances to score on offense. But I do wonder about this QB shuffling, kind of how it plays out. I think Morton's going to get the start Saturday. And I guess in some ways, TCU has had plenty of experience with quarterback switching out in the middle of games because of the injury. But, Will Howard came in and completely changed the dynamic of that football game in that K-State contest. Same with Jason Bean at Kansas. And in both instances, they were expecting to face running QBs, and they ended up facing guys that could throw. Now, I think the good news is all three of these players are somewhat similar. Now, Smith can beat you with his legs a little bit more than Morton and Shook can, even though Shook has some athleticism. I haven't really seen Morton run much. But they're trying to pass the football. I mean, that's what they're doing with Zach Kitley, who's if you know that name, he was offensive coordinator as a Houston Baptist. He had Bailey Zappi, who's now with the Patriots, and then he went to Western Kentucky, and now he's in Lubbock. So they're trying to throw the ball. They're running a lot of plays. They go for it on almost every fourth down. And it's going to be a test for this defense. Now, if they can get off the field effectively and cause turnovers and get turnovers on downs, and I really like what TCU can do on offense because we know when they have a short field, they've excelled this season. But I'm just interested to see how this plays out. I think it's going to be a tough test with if these QBs are kind of getting in and out of the lineup, which I don't hate that because I think that hurts Tech in some ways. But can the TCU defense consistently adjust? Because in some ways they've been really good at that. Like coming out of halftime this year, they've been good at adjusting and making things happen. But on the fly with QB changes, they've struggled at times to kind of get their bearings about them. It's taking a couple of drives. So we'll see what that looks like when Tech and TCU hit the field on Saturday. But yeah, big time game at Amon G. Carter. Going to be an 11 a.m. kickoff. The big noon Saturday crew will be there. So that's like the Fox alternative to College Game Day. They've staked their claim as the 11 a.m. window as their big game of the week. So national television this week and next week with Texas Tech and Texas back-to-back. Good platform for the Frogs to try to show up and show out. That'll do it for Locked On Horned Frogs today. We'll be back on Thursday. Appreciate you listening. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day.